Sorry, bear with me. Okay, it's working. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajeem. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Thank you for joining in. I realize it's been a while since we've had a webinar. So those of you who join us normally would realize that we have normally a webinar every month or so. And this hasn't been possible recently. Part of the reason why this hasn't been possible is we've been doing different initiatives, which inshallah we'll speak of. But also personally, I've been hugely affected by what's happening currently in Gaza, and in every webinar discussion we were having, who to bring on with the team, every one-to-one I have, and people who join me in our support circles, on every circle, there was the mention of Palestine and this issue. And I thought that normally we, as a support system for Muslims, we don't cover topics outside of sexual or gender identity, but I thought that this was event was something that collectively in the one-to-one sessions, in our support circles, that this was something that we did want to raise and we wanted to talk about and really understand it, and give due diligence to it. And I'm so happy that we do have our speaker, our Sheikh, who is far more knowledgeable about this than I am. And we are very grateful for his time, because I know he's already lecturing, so he's agreed to do this just before his other lecture. So I really appreciate that. So as we normally do, we start with a few verses in the Quran. The reason why I chose the webinar topic as children of Israel was chapter 17 of the Quran, either called Surah al-Isra or Surah al-Bani Israel, talks about the children of Israel. And the verses which I've put here are an interesting verse, and Sheikh here has an entire lecture which is dedicated to this verse, which you can see, but I'm briefly going to mention it here because it's an interesting verse. This is verse 4 of chapter 17. And the way Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala starts is he says, وَقَضَيْنَا, which means that it is something which is definitely written, definitely a decree which is going to pass. So this is not something which is conditional. This is something which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has decreed. And he decrees it to who? To Bani Israel, the children of Israel, fil kitab. Again, you can say that the kitab is revelation, Torah. This is something that he is specially mentioned in his books before. Causing that they will cause corruption. Now it's interesting because this verse is not whether this is talking about the future or the past. It is sometimes you're thinking it's ambiguous if this is future or past, but obviously the verse which comes before helps us with this in understanding whether this is talking about the future or past. Fil arz marratain. You will cause corruption in the land twice. Not once, not thrice, twice. It's interesting that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chooses to say twice and specifies that, distinguishing it from only one time or three times or multiple times. No, twice. And then to add to that, that it's not just facade, you will become extremely arrogant, or you would have alone kabira, and you can look into the Quranic reference of what arrogance is, whether it's from a tyrannical sense, from I think Sheikh now mentioned Surah Al-Qasas in terms of Fir'aun, or you're just looking at someone who's really arrogant and are boastful. And inshallah, in the second part of what we'll talk today, we'll talk about insolence. We'll talk about the type of insolence which we do see today. The verse which carries on then kind of answers a little bit whether this is talking about the future or the past. فَإِذَا جَاءَ وَعْدُ أَوَّلِهِمَا, when the first of the two promises or the warnings came to pass, we would send against you some of our servants, ibad lana. So again, this is talking about Allah saying these are our servants. So it's a clear indication that the servants which he's talking about is someone that he's happy with, or somebody that's designated. Allah designates these people as his servants. Ba'sin shadid, and of great might, who go to the inner parts of ad-diyar, khalal ad-diyar, the inner parts or of your homes, or they take your homes. So this is talking about a military force which God has decreed, and a lot of mufassirin have talked about that this alludes to the end of times, it alludes to Imam Mahdi alayhi salam. And I think that's why it's very interesting that this verse is talking about past, but it's also talking about the future in this concept. And again, this would be a warning fulfilled. So again, hinting this is a promise, this is something talking about future, and so on. And I think there's an obvious link between, in our eschatology, in Islamic eschatology, of what end of times, Imam Mahdi, and the state of Palestine, and that is already there. So I thought we'd start with that. Some of you who might be joining and don't really know what we do, we're a peer support organization for Muslims who struggle with sexual or gender identity. We offer a free consultation, which you can go on our website and you can book to. This includes parents, includes men and women. Recently, we've also had a lot of influx from people from the Arab world wanting touch. So you can see that we do provide an Arabic circle as well for people who are seeking help in Arabic. At current, we have vacancies in our new circle, Mondays, 6 p.m. We already have 2 circles for men. We need now a 3rd circle, and that's been opened up for people on Mondays at 6 p.m. On Sundays, 12:30, we have a women's circle. We have 2 Arabic circles. The second one, which we're now opening, is on Fridays at 4 p.m. There's also one-to-one coaching. There's also training for mosque. Firstly, Sheikh now was the first, and credit to the Leeds community, to be the first mosque in the Leeds community that we went to since we started to talk about this. And again, credit to Leeds Muslim Youth Group, all the people who do that in really doing the great work that they're doing, and inshallah, we continue to work with them, and that's what we're doing. We're happy to work with mosques, to work with other organizations. We do these webinars, they're completely free, they're available on YouTube, and we do this so inshallah there's more awareness on this issue. For those of you who might not know Sheikh Jaffer Ladak, I've known him for a number of years. I've had the pleasure of knowing him for a number of years. And I can certainly say, if I think about somebody who's aware of the landscape, aware of our responsibilities, and especially aware of our responsibilities, I would think no other than Sheikh Jaffer. He has been the director of the DRC Group, supplying locum doctors to NHS. Actually, I think he worked with my father at some point as well, which is, I'll just put in there. In 2011, he began his Islamic studies in 2005 under the Jaami'a Hawzat of Grand Ayatollah Syed Taqi al-Modarresi in Holy Karbala. He has also studied in al-Mahdi Institute in Birmingham and the Islamic College of London. He holds a master's degree in Islamic Law from the Islamic College, and did his dissertation on the Islamic theory of global citizenship. He's authored 4 books, which I will go into. And he previously has been the resident Alim in London, North London, Stanmore, and Hyderi. He is the current Alim of Baab al-Ilm Center in Leeds. And as I said previously, he's well known for his activism, especially for his support for Palestine and dealing with the far right. So if you want more of this, from what we're seeing, he has an entire series, which is called Exploring the References to Banu Israel in the Quran. And I do recommend it. You'll see the one that I was referring to, Creating Great Mischief in the World Twice. The ayah which I mentioned, you can go into that and you can go. And I do recommend this because I think a lot of the Sheikh uses the method of reading Quran by Quran. So he will mention other verses in the Quran which are related, and it's a brilliant way of discovering the Quran. He writes often. Every time I speak to him, he's like, I'm working on this book, I'm doing this, and mashallah. And you know, the books which I have personally read, I can recommend, and they're really about topics which are not covered well, and they're things which are not really known. So these 3 books, for example, in a scholarly level, the first one, Star Among Stars, talks about the brilliant life of the famous Sahabi Jabir ibn Abdullah al-Ansari. It's a fantastic book of his life. I really recommend you to read it. Again, another personality, the daughter of Sayyidah Fatima, who obviously we're remembering these days. Umm Kulsum, again, a personality which is not known, not talked about. And then there's also a book of fantastic stories from the ulama, which is the ways of the righteous. Then he also has other books which deal with socio-political avenues. So the fantastic book on Yemen, which I know that part of the sales of it, he's actually given to charitable causes. A fantastic book, especially if you see what is happening in Yemen, and again, how that links to the Quran and how that links to present ahadith. There's fantastic compilation of ahadith to do with health, hayatun tayyiba, the pure life. And the one which the most recent one, as we go through the living crisis and the impact on that. And actually, based on this last book, which had quite a profound effect on me in my ignorance to Islamic finance and how that is done, we've started an initiative, and this is the first time I am announcing this initiative. So we're announcing the initiative of loans. As if you would read in the book, there's Islamic evidence to show giving loans to people who are needy is actually more beneficial than just giving charity by itself. And we realize that in our population, there is a lot of people cannot afford therapy, and they cannot afford support because of that financial constraint. So we felt that it was important that for people like that we do provide the support in terms of monthly repayments, which they can manage, so that they are able to get that support. This is a pilot. This is what we're starting off. But we wanted to put that into place. I wanted to announce it today with the blessing of the Sheikh, to take this forward. And without further ado, I would welcome the Sheikh who is with us. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Sayyidina, how are you?
Alhamdulillah. So good to have you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the kind invite, and salamu alaikum to all the dear viewers and participants.
Thank you. So it's a huge topic, but I know we're going to split it into two parts for the sake of time. I'm very interested in the notion that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does say in the Quran that we gave them importance, we distinguished them. And when I do speak to, I actually have friends who are in Israel, right? So I have friends who, because of this community which I work with Christians, I work with Jews, and so on. And what they say to me is, look, what we believe is we are the chosen people, and this is our land, and God says this. They say God says this in the Quran. God very clearly says in the Quran that we did prefer them. We preferred Bani Israel over other nations. How do we understand this from a Quranic perspective? How do we rationalize this with an Islamic perspective? Because that is the argument they use when they say, well, this was, before Palestine even existed, like we were talking about 1948, they say, they even call it now Judea and Samaria, how they're addressing it. They're addressing it through the biblical names. And we have this in the Quran where there is this talk about God's chosen people. Yes, how do we rationalize this concept?
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وصلي يا ربي على محمد وآله الطاهرين. So this is such an important topic to the entire framing of our theologies, the relationship between people and the land of Palestine, between Muslims, Jews, and Christians, and even makes up much of the contemporary world's understanding of its foreign policy, the way in which it would treat the idea of differing and disparate communities. So from the Islamic perspective, we have to take a starting point about God, about Allah, and just be very conscious that when God reveals revelation and he speaks about any group of people, he is not speaking from the perspective of favor. This is God. He is dispassionate in that sense, using our normative language. He's dispassionate about that. He's going to be speaking from the perspective of truth and trying to reinforce understanding of truth itself. Therefore, he's not scared to be able to share the details of history or to be able to emphasize people that are on right or on wrong. And he doesn't look at which group follow which religion or which sect per se. He looks at the belief systems and the actions of people and wants to be able to reinforce truth. At times, the Quran is very, very critical of Muslims. At times, the Quran is critical of certain sects from amongst Jews or Christians and the types of beliefs that they hold or actions that they do. Because the Quran does not compromise in that way. It's not favoring one group of people or the other. Therefore, when we read these verses, we are not doing so in order to undermine a particular faith group, but rather to be able to revise our understanding of what is historically and theologically accurate when it comes to much of these sensitive issues. If there is one chosen group of people or one chosen race or heritage of people above all the rest of mankind, then we should know about it. Or if there's one chosen land that has been gifted to a people until the end of time, then we should know about these things. The Quran raises both of these topics because the Jews at the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they had much of this theology and their history at the forefront of their minds as well. And therefore, when the Quran revises the story of Pharaoh and revises the story of the post-Egyptian world that Banu Israel now move into, this is a very central part of the discourse inside the city of Medina al-Munawwara between the three faith groups. Therefore, the Quran seeks to be able to clarify many, many issues that over hundreds of years may have either been lost or may have been misunderstood. This is the first assumption or discussion point that we need to have. The second is something that you mentioned in passing. When we look at the Quran, we cannot take a verse in isolation. No single verse speaks about one issue in its entirety. It is akin to a jigsaw puzzle. A puzzle has many pieces to it. And when you put the pieces together in the right order, that is when you can behold the proper picture and the entirety of what is trying to be shown to you. If you miss out a piece, then you miss out the entirety of the puzzle. The more pieces you miss out, the less of the picture that you have to hand. Therefore, when studying the topic of Banu Israel in the Quran, or specifically the question of the language that God uses, or the issues of the entering into Palestine and taking Palestine as a sovereign state or a sovereign region for themselves, how does God actually frame it in the Quran such that we understand how God is trying to realign the thinking of people that may have sort of bastardized their understanding, perverted their understanding, either willfully or otherwise. So we have to take it from these two humble perspectives, and then we can actually enter into the conversation proper now. So I invite my audience, my brothers and sisters who are watching this show from whatever faith or non-faith background that you come from. If you can Google it or open your Qur'ans, you can start from chapter number 5 of the Quran, Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse number 20. This verse picks up at the point when God says to his people, Banu Israel, that they have been gifted certain blessings. Now, in other verses of the Quran, you will find that God actually says that I have preferred you over all other nations. We will come to that shortly. But here we need to look at, number one, God's raising them and why and how he raised them to this position of prominence. And then the subsequent verse, verse number 21, is going to look at the topic of entering into the state of Palestine. So chapter 5, verse 20, verse 21. We'll spend 5 or 10 minutes reading these verses and discussing these verses, inshallah. So I'll read the Arabic and I'll read the translation so that people can understand with me exactly what we want to be able to express. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I begin reciting the Quran in the name of God, the most kind, the most merciful. وَإِذْ قَالَ مُوسَى لِقَوْمِهِ. When Musa alayhi salam, Prophet Moses, said to his community, Ya qawmi, O my community, اذْكُرُوا نِعْمَةَ اللَّهِ عَلَيْكُمْ. Bring to mind the blessing of Allah upon you. So, what is this blessing? إِذْ جَعَلَ فِيكُمْ أَنْبِيَاءَ. Number one, the first blessing that is mentioned in this particular ayah is that God raised up prophets amongst you. Number two, what else did God give to the community of Moses? وَجَعَلَكُمْ مُلُوكًا. And Allah made you sovereign. He made you a sovereign, independent people who are masters of a land. Another translation is that He's made kings for you. I use the translation, He has made you sovereign. We'll talk about why in a minute, inshallah. وَآتَاكُمْ مَا لَمْ يُؤْتِ أَحَدًا مِنَ الْعَالَمِينَ. And He has given you what He has not given to anyone else in the world. So you can see here a number of blessings in which God has given to the children of Israel. Prophets, made them mulukan. Whatever the meaning of mulukan is, it's debated whether it's meaning sovereign or kings. Number three, and He has granted you favors such that He has not granted to anyone else within the world. Now, in another verse of the Quran, in chapter number 2, Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 122, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says the following to the same community, the children of Israel. It says, Ya Bani Israel, udhkuru ni'matiya allati an'amtu alaykum wa anna faddaltukum ala al-alamin. O children of Israel, remember my blessings which I gave you, and that I preferred you above all humankind, or I honored you, or I favored you above all other people. We have a general meaning and a general way to be able to understand this. So when we put these sorts of verses together, as we said, we do Jaami'a of them, we gather the verses together like we would do a jigsaw puzzle. We have to think about, when God chooses a set of people, what is meant by this? And number one, we know that Banu Israel are not the only people to have ever been given prophets. There are people before Banu Israel and outside of Banu Israel that have been given prophets, correct? For example, the immediate community of Adam, alayhi salam, or the immediate community of Nuh, alayhi salam, or the people from other than the Ishaq lineage, Isaac lineage of Abraham. There is also Ismail and his lineage of prophets. So the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, I have given you blessings, amongst those blessings are that you have prophets amongst you, this does not make them distinguished. This does not make Banu Israel distinguished in any other way. They are like other groups of people that have received prophets. For example, there is, the prophets that have come to the people of Yemen, that have come to the people of Syria, and so on and so forth. So this doesn't distinguish as being above other peoples, it means that this is a blessing to you. Now, let us ask a reason. Why would a people need prophets? A people need prophets because they need guidance. If you're not on guidance and you don't have guidance, what are you on? Misguidance. You're on darkness. You're not an illuminated person. You see, if you, Sayyid, for example, are already a guided human being, living the pinnacle of God's law, and you are the perfect human being and an example for other people, there is no need for God to send you a prophet. You're already guided. God needs to send guidance to people that are not guided, that are laboring in the acts of what? Polytheism, murder, theft, corruption, misguidance. So when God sends prophets to the people of Banu Israel, this is not a fadl, this is not a blessing that they are special. This is a blessing that God gave to them guidance when they were languishing in misguidance. The same thing is for the Arabs when they received the blessing of the presence of the Holy Prophet Muhammad al-Mustafa sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam. The Quran says in chapter number 3 of the Quran, Surah Al-Imran, that they, the Arabs, in the period of Jahiliyyah, in the decades and centuries leading up to the coming of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi, that they were living as if they were teetering on the edge of a pit of fire, an abyss of fire. They needed the Prophet. They needed a prophet to come because of the ways in which they were living. They were living in a state of Jahiliyyah. And what the extent of their Jahiliyyah, you all know. They used to bury their daughters alive. They used to have constant war with one another. They used to prostitute out their own family members. There was no rights for people. And the Prophet came and changed all of that. A blessing is when God gives you a prophet, it's because you are a people who need guidance. It's not a blessing that you are somehow better than everybody else. And Banu Israel have been given so many prophets. In fact, there is no community in the history of humanity that has been given more prophets than Banu Israel. Why? Because they needed more prophets than anyone else because of the ways in which they were living. It is not a fadl that you are raised above everybody. It is a fadl because you need it. It's a blessing that God had to give it to you and not the people of Mexico, not the people of Australia, not the people of Canada and their historical peoples. They were good people. They used to live as organized people. That's why God didn't need to send them. You know, the Aborigines, the people who are living as natives, they lived beautifully on the land. There wasn't that corruption in their society. God didn't need to send them those prophets. Which people were languishing in corruption and lack of faith? People, children of Israel. That's why God sends them prophets. Second part of the verse, what does the verse say? Chapter 5, verse 20. So we raised amongst you prophets, and we made you وَجَعَلْنَا مُلُوكًا. The verse says, وَجَعَلَكُمْ مُلُوكًا. We made you sovereign, or we made you kings. Okay. Now, this is an important point. As you know, there are kings that have been raised amongst, the children of Israel, King David and such. But the meaning of king is not king in the secular sense. You're not talking about someone with a staff and a crown and a, this is not the meaning of it. When God raises kings, he means leaders. Now, if you take it as sovereign or as power and authority, then again, it is a similar meaning, isn't it? Whether you translate it as sovereign over the land or kings over the land, God gave them this as a blessing. And what is meant by this is that when they were gifted the land of Palestine, they were given sovereignty over that land. Now, why were they given this? This is the important condition. When they were toiling under the lash of Pharaoh, they were slaves. They were butchered. They were killed. What does a people who are killed long for more than anything else? Safe land. A land where they can prosper and live freely, and they can have faith freely, and they can create their own civilization freely, far, far away from the ways in which they are being strangled at the moment. The Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam has a hadith where he says, "La khayra fil watan illa ma'al amni was surur." No, there's no value to living in a place without safety and happiness. These are two things, basic elements to living somewhere. When Banu Israel were being massacred by the Pharaoh on account of their faith and knowing that there was a Moses that was going to be born from amongst them, and that's why Pharaoh was killing each generation one by one, the males. What did they need and long for more than anything else? God gave it to them. God gave them a land by which they could live freely in. Now, the fact that God gives them that land, that has to be on the premise that they are living according to the rules of God, or that they are living in a way in which God, or that they don't actually do the things that the Pharaoh is doing. Because otherwise they're no better than the Pharaoh. If you're going to do exactly the same things as a Pharaoh did, massacre people, kill people, and so on and so forth, then the people that you are going to kill and going to massacre are going to make the same dua. We want a sovereign land from ourselves. We're being killed by these people. So again, it's not a blessing that is in the sense of God is choosing a people over others. It is in the sense that we are giving you kings, we're giving you leadership, divine leadership. And with divine leadership, outside of prophets, and sovereignty outside of prophets, such as kings, there is duties that come along with this. Number two. And last, number three, we gave you what he had not given anyone else in the world. And what are those things that God gave? God gave them a land. God gave them revelation. God gave them all the chances that he had not given to other people. Think about this question. You know, when you see the Old Testament and you see the number of nations that God destroys, right? Let's just take Noah's community. Noah prayed against them. God destroyed those. And you have it with so many other prophets in the Quran as well, that their communities were prayed against them, or they used to say, all right, we challenge God, bring your disaster if you're truthful. And then God destroyed them. Allah gave a special blessing to the people of Banu Israel, that generally speaking, what you can see is every time God asks them to do something, they fail. They create blasphemy, corruption, murder. God doesn't destroy them. God gives them another chance. God gives them another chance. God gives them another chance. You know, they were said to don't do business on the Sabbath. What did they do? They went out, put their fishing nets in order to try to trick God that they weren't going to do business and catch fish on the day of the Sabbath. God saw what they were doing. Or he says, I'm going to take Moses, I'm going to give him revelation. They started worshipping an idol again in 40 days. Every time they disobey God and challenge God and say God is, God's hand is shackled, every time they blaspheme against God, God gives them another chance. So it is not simply by saying he's not, when we say he has given you something that he has not given to anyone else in the world, he's given you chance after chance, he's given you guidance after guidance. Okay. Now we go back to that verse that we just cross-referenced very briefly for 1 minute, chapter number 2, verse 122. O children of Israel, remember the favors upon you and how I honored you above others, right? وَأَنَّا فَضَّلْتُكُمْ عَلَى الْعَالَمِينَ, above other nations, above the rest of the world. This is the meaning of it. It's not that God is saying, you are the chosen people to the exclusivity of others. The meaning is, I have chosen you and favored you by giving you guidance, by giving you prophets, by giving you the greatest of the prophets, by giving you the greatest of revelation. Everything that you need for your guidance has been gifted to you. This is how you are favored above others. There are other nations, they haven't been given so many hundreds of prophets, haven't been given chance after chance, haven't been given a sovereign land, haven't been given, but you have been given it. Now, in Surah Al-Jum'ah, chapter number 62 of the Holy Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ya ayyuhalladhina hadu, in za'amtum, أنكم أولياء لله من دون الناس فتمنوا الموت إن كنتم صادقين. It's a little bit above. I think if you scroll up a little bit, there you go. There you go. Verse number 6. So here, in case anyone thinks that God has chosen Banu Israel in the sense of them being favored and as a chosen people just by virtue of their race, their heritage, their birthright, in case anyone mix up the ideas of, I've chosen you for guidance, I've chosen to help you reach guidance, versus I've chosen you as being the chosen people, God clarifies, because they misunderstood this. They bastardized their own religion. Every people like to say, we're God's favorites. Man United fans say it. We're the best team in the world. Liverpool fans say it. We're the best team in the world. Real Madrid fans, we're the greatest club in the world. Americans say it. We have the best country in the world. Britain say it. We're the best nation in the world. This is different. This is playing around with God. When you say we are the chosen people of God, you are making God a party hat and placing it on you. The only reason why God favored you was because you needed guidance. He didn't favor you because you're some born person that happened to be born into a particular family. This is nonsense. And if anyone is stupid enough to believe that they are favored beside anyone else because they just happen to be born into a particular family or into a particular race, then this is racism, this is extremism, this is prejudice. As a Muslim, I can't say I am favored over someone else just because I'm born Muslim. No, Allah says in the Quran that the best amongst you are those people with the most God consciousness. Inna akramakum indallahi atqakum. The best amongst you are those people with the most God consciousness. Now, if you're a Muslim, a Christian, a Jew, a Sunni, a Shia, a Barelvi, an Asuli, an Akhbari, whatever your belief system, the more conscious you are of God, the more disciplined you are in your worship of God, in your mannerisms and character, this makes you more proximate to God. So God uses this verse number 6 that we are looking at, verse number 7, to clarify to the Jews that you are not chosen in the sense in which you're trying to make out the false interpretation that you've purposely gifted yourselves in order to make yourselves seem preferred to everybody else. Have a look at the verse. Qul, say, Ya ayyuhalladhina hadu, in za'amtum, if you claim, annakum awliya'u lillahi min dunin nas, that you are the chosen people besides all of the rest of humanity, fatamannaw al-mawta in kuntum sadiqin, invoke death upon yourself if you really are truthful in what you say. Then God immediately follows it up. وَلَا يَتَمَنَّوْنَهُ أَبَدًا بِمَا قَدَّمَتْ أَيْدِيهِمْ. But they will never invoke death upon themselves because of what their hands have sent forward, what they have done. See, again, it's on taqwa, it's on God consciousness. If they truly believe that because of their deeds they were the chosen people of God, then they would say, I'm ready for death, take me. My deeds are so outstanding, I'm ready to meet God. No human being dare sayeth that. Or if we can say only a few human beings have ever dared say that, and the extent to which they've said it is people like Ali ibn Abi Talib, when he was struck on his head, he said, Fuztu wa Rabbil Ka'aba. I swear by my Lord, I have been successful. Even then, he doesn't invoke death upon himself. He makes an exclamation that, yeah, I think I've done well in life. But he doesn't dare invoke death and challenge God to say, I'm chosen besides the rest of humanity. Because I am chosen, because I'm born chosen into a race, into a preferred religion. Now, this is really important because we're tackling the psyche of what is present in the world. In every community says, we're the best, we're the best, we're the chosen people. Allah is challenging that notion, saying, no, this is not correct. Now, at this point, Sayyid, I don't want to make it too much of a monologue. What are your thoughts on this particular verse and understanding just this verse, chapter 5, verse 20, before we move into 5:21 and God gifting them the land of Palestine?
You can see it's very live, my little one.
Say again?
It's okay. It's okay. I've just been looking at this, and I'm thinking of our own communities when we, like we have this in our communities. Oh, he's Sayyid, he's better, or we have this in all communities. But I've been reminded by someone at school who's a not good student, so he gets all the attention from the teachers. So the teacher has to spend more time with that student. So now we have to that kid gets more special treatment, not because he's special, but because he needs that treatment. So it's kind of thinking of that analogy. If God gave you so much and preferred you, it isn't because perhaps that you're really good, it's because you need that guidance.
You need a leg up. You're the naughty kid in the class.
Yes.
And we need to give you a bit of a leg up, take you out of class, give you the extra homework. It's not a favor that God makes you chosen and everybody else is the rat race and everybody else is the riffraff of the world. It's not how God works. This is a very shallow, racist theology to think this. It's a very abhorrent theology, even just by ordinary strands of morality, to say God thinks I'm better than you just on the basis that I was born into a particular family or into a particular region or a particular race. Nobody would accept this in the historical world, let alone the contemporary world. I don't understand why people accept it till today. But because everyone claims to be favored by God, and Americans say God is we're God's favorite country on earth, and God protect America, and all this. Everybody does it, but in Islam, this is absolutely prohibited, and God challenges you that if you think this, invoke death, and you'll see that the moment you die, whoa, you're going to get a big awakening. You're going to get a big slap that this is not how God works. So this is chapter 5, verse 20. The next verse, chapter 5, verse 21, is very briefly the story of Palestine. And because of the favors that were given to Banu Israel, amongst them was, off the back of the patience that many of them showed and their supplication that they made for a land in which they could be free to worship their God, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave them the opportunity to have that. Ya qawmi, udkhulu al-ardha al-muqaddasa allati kataba Allah lakum wa la tartaddu ala adbarikum fatanqalibu khasirin. God says, my people, or Musa alayhi salam says, my people, enter the Holy Land which God has promised you. Now, it's really interesting. I just want to make this point. Every time Musa says, Qawmi, you're my people, you belong to me, Musa. Not God says, you are my people, you are my chosen people. Never does God say, "O Banu Israel, you are my chosen people, enter into the land." Musa says, "My people, my community, enter into the Holy Land, which God has promised you. Do not turn your back, otherwise you will become losers." Now, subsequently, what happens? They respond by saying that we are not going to enter into this land. We're not going to do that. We'll never enter it until they leave. And if they leave, we will enter into it. And they say, you and your God, you go and deal with this. And this is why later on in other historical texts, we know that they were then sent into the desert to roam for 40 years until they could come back. And every time that they tried to remain in the land of Israel for more than 80 years, 80, every time they tried to stay in the land for more than 80 years, they've always been flung out of the land. Why? Because this is not a permanent home for them, on the basis that they have always created corruption and they've always gone against God whenever they've been given that land. So this is a historical discussion that takes more time for us to be able to delve into, and inshallah on another time we can actually look at those historical sources where they've only ever had that land for more than 80 years or around 80 years, and then at the point of 80 years, that's when the downfall of their term has started. This is a whole other conversation. Nevertheless, the point I want to start with is that when we talk about chosen people, we are talking about chosen for guidance, chosen to receive guidance, and chosen on the conditions that they follow God's law. The moment they begin to break God's law, then God does not retain those favors to them, but that they lose those favors that have been gifted to them. Now, that is the sunnah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Throughout the Quran, whenever a people have broken the favors of God or the covenants with God, Allah has taken away those favors from them. And you can see that throughout the Quran. If you want to see that, that's mentioned for the Jews, it's mentioned for the Christians, and it's mentioned for the Muslims as well. And that's mentioned in chapter number 5 from verse 10 to 17, just as an FYI. And you can go and see those verses in your own time. But the idea is that you understand this starting point. So I leave it over to you, Sayyid, to be able to think about these particular starting points. And then inshallah we can conclude with the other verses from Surah Al-Isra, which talk about the mischief that Israel or Banu Israel will make.
So it's interesting what what you're mentioning here is whenever I just ask that just because Allah is favoring them doesn't mean that they're necessarily that's a good thing, and it's because they've needed that guidance. So it almost means that if you've not been given the guidance and you're still doing good, then that's better, isn't it? Like what we have currently, where we don't have say a visible leader, and where we are still holding on to that. So it's almost like the more God has given you, the harder it becomes, because the more duty then you have on, well, I really should have known, because this land had so many messengers being sent on it that it should know what's right and what's wrong. And yes, so then and we have this statement which we discussed earlier, like with Fir'aun, to say he was haughty, or he was like we say alun kabir, as that they seem to take this as a source of pride, rather than looking at what the message is, or For example, saying, "Oh, we're the best people because we're having the most messengers," or God doesn't destroy us; He destroys other nations, or God's giving us another chance. But they see that more of a state of pride rather than what. So it's almost like turning a blind eye to what actually is happening. Um, and with the current state that we are seeing in Israel, I just want to distinguish that there are Jews who say, well, this state of Israel maybe was meant to be a Jewish state, but it's not a Jewish state in terms of it's not going by Torah law and how it's being implemented. I don't think there is anybody would disagree that if the Jews wanted a state and that state then complied with the laws which were under the Torah, and it was acquired in that way, that then it would be a Jewish state. But what we're seeing is that there's a distinguishment between the two, and that's why sometimes I struggle because in the Quran, sometimes we're talking about Ahlul Kitab in a very good way, right? And sometimes we're talking about them in perhaps a negative way. And for me at least, that's the distinguishment between Judaism and Zionism, right? So one is a political insolent entity which isn't listening to the teachings of Moses, the teaching of the Torah, and is, as you said, it's more racial. It's, well, I'm born a Jew, and it's that type. So it'll be very interesting to see what, from a Quranic analysis, to talk about the insolence or this type of,
So it's so beautiful that you mention this. I, in my humble view, in 1945 to 1948, where tens of thousands of Jewish refugees left Europe to arrive in Palestine, I imagine if they had bought the land and said, we want a Jewish homeland, we would like to make a state where Jews feel safe, we can practice rabbinic law, we can apply the Torah freely and not have to worry about people massacring us for our identity, would you Muslims support us in that? I believe that the Muslim world, that the Arab world, would have been very sympathetic to that cause, especially considering how many times previously Muslims have looked after the Jewish populations better than anyone else in the history of humanity. Maybe some would have said, no, this is the Ummah, this is the Muslim lands. Maybe some would have said yes. We won't know. It's a historical hypothetical that we can't really know the answer to now, right? Now, what's interesting is not only potentially could they have had a state off the basis of a genuine foundation, such as by asking for that, the mithaq, the covenant that God talks about with the Jews or with Banu Israel, includes that you're not permitted to throw people off houses, right? In chapter 2, Surah Al-Baqarah, verse number 83, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, verse 84, my apologies, chapter number 2, verse number 84, it says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, وَإِذْ أَخَذْنَا مِيثَاقَكُمْ لَا تَسْفِكُونَ دِمَاءَكُمْ وَلَا تُخْرِجُونَ أَنفُسَكُمْ مِنْ دِيَارِكُمْ. That amongst the covenant that God made with them, that you will not shed one another's blood or shed your blood, and you will not drive people from their own homes, from their own houses. So when you base a state off bloodshed and off throwing people off their homes, This is in direct contravention to the actual pledge.
Subhanallah.
And what's really interesting, think about this really logically. God is all-knowing. God is all-wise. Imagine I have a particular thing that I'm going to do in the future. God knows. God knows I'm going to kill Sayyid Jaffer. God forbid. And he comes to me and he says, I want you to make a pledge. You're never going to kill Sayyid Jaffer, right? Of course I'm not going to. What are you talking about, Allah? God, I'm not going to do that. Pledge to me. I pledge to you. I'm never going to. He explicitly makes a pledge not to do these things because he knows that in the future that's something that's going to bring my downfall. So in the actual pledge that God gives, the mithaq, لا تسفكون دماءكم ولا تخرجون أنفسكم. Don't have it that in yourselves you can actually shed blood and that you can kick people off their land, out of their houses. Because if you can do this to yourself, to fellow Jews, fellow believers, then, subhanAllah, you'll do it to Muslims in the future. So God, from the outset of his covenant with them, made this covenant, this commitment not to engage in these behaviors. Yet they created a state off the back of ethnic cleansing, genocide, mass murder, and even until now, subhanAllah, Sayyidina, the land of Gaza is smaller than London. And it's had the equivalent of more than 3 atom bombs dropped on it. That's incredible. Just think about how much damage that's done, or how much. Can you just imagine the extent of, and just as an FYI, I'm sure you've seen this, Sayyid, you're more up to date on the news than I am, but there's a UK MP by the name of Layla Moran, Christian.
Yes.
And she actually has made a public statement that her family members are trapped inside a church in Palestine, in Gaza City, on week 1 of Israel's massacres after October the 7th. Their house got bombed. So when you say they're going after Hamas or they're going after, they bombed the houses of Christian Palestinians. Then the families of this MP, Christian UK Member of Parliament, they fled into a church. They've had food and water blocked from them inside the church. She is now complaining, a UK MP publicly is now complaining that there are snipers, Israeli snipers, that are shooting Christian refugees inside the church. And she actually says, with the extent of the lack of water and food, I don't think that they're going to live till Christmas. Now, if you're bombing Christians and then you're snipering them inside a church and you're blocking food and water from them, if that's what you're doing to Christians, imagine what you're doing to the Muslims in Palestine. This is never a war on Hamas. This is a punishment for all Palestinians for being Palestinian. This is the definition, textbook definition of a war crime. And God told them, you can't shed blood. You can't throw people out of their houses, let alone bomb them out of their houses. This is really important because, as I said at the beginning of the discussion, we're not showing favoritism. God isn't choosing a side. He's not wearing a party hat. Not a football scarf wrapped around the neck, saying this is truth and this is falsehood. God's name, Huwa al-Haq, he is absolute truth. When he speaks truth, he's telling you the history and the circumstances of these matters. Sadly, many people have completely forgotten these points.
And even in the verses, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about this, when he says, like when we started, he says marratain, he says it will be very clear. It will be very distinguishedly clear that what's happening is facade, it's corruption. It won't be, like sometimes it's like, oh, maybe it's that, maybe it isn't. But I think this is perhaps the first time in history where we are witnessing the scale of ethnic cleansing, genocide, and it's been shown to us day by day,
live streamed
media. It's live streamed, and yet still, people are saying, they're not saying there's no evidence now because the evidence is there, but they're just being one-sided. There's no other, because there's no other way. There's no other defense which is left. And I think it's beautiful how the Quran is so clear. Like it is said that in these end of times, the truth and falsehood will become very, very clear in view. And I think that is something which is what we're witnessing now. To see that when Allah says facade, that facade would be very clear, not just for Muslims, but for non-Muslims as well to see.
Ahsant. And as you said, people, it's not just one-sided. There's a dehumanization of the Palestinians that allows massacre and genocide to be normalized. And there is, because of this notion that the Jews are either chosen people, or that they get to be able to use the notions of anti-Semitism when we speak out against genocide, all these things. Between all of these things coming together, this is why we actually can see genocide happening in front of our eyes. And when we said never again, or when the Germans coined this phrase originally, never again, the way they understood never again and the way in which we understand never again is completely different, it seems. Because when we say never again, we mean never, never again. When they say never again
has its conditions.
On these conditions that, well, it can be never again, but the Palestinians can be massacred. So yeah, I think we should move to the last verse, chapter 17, Surah Al-Isra, which you started with in your introduction, so beautifully read and explained. And you and I have had a couple of conversations about these verses in our meetings and gatherings, and it's just an incredible set of verses, because the Quran isn't just a book of sort of holy law or theology. It is also a book prophesizing the future. And very, very rarely do people think about the Quran in the context of speaking about what's going to occur tomorrow. Whereas here we actually have a verse predicting that there's going to be an Israel or a children of Israel that's going to cause mass harm and great incidents to the world. And then there's actually going to be people that are going to stand up against that. That's an incredible prediction. And you can see it unfolding today and in the times in which we live in. And that's beautiful for us to know that if we're truly on the path of God and truth, that if he's telling us there's people that are going to stand up to massacre. And as the verse said, fasad fil ard, la tufsidunna fil ard marratain. And then there are people who are uli ba'sin shadid, servants of God with great strength and might, who are actually going to fight back, as you worded it. I think you said this suggests it's a military campaign. And military campaigns are not only today fought on battlefields. It's on the internet, and it's in propaganda, and it's in what's happening in Yemen with stopping ships that are going to this apartheid state, like we reveled in when it came to the 1990s, and stopping economies working with South Africa. We lauded this in the same way we laud it when it comes to Yemen stopping tankers with their cargoes getting to Israel to be able to support genocide, as you alluded to very beautifully. This is a real world event that's happening, unfolding in our eyes, that the Quran predicted 1400 years ago. So we can read the verse. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. وَقَضَيْنَا إِلَى بَنِي إِسْرَائِيلَ فِي الْكِتَابِ لَتُفْسِدُنَّ فِي الْأَرْضِ مَرَّتَيْنِ. Now, you explained the word قَضَيْنَا. This has been determined by God. This is something that God is telling you is going to happen, a prediction. The actual word that I want to focus on for the moment is very interesting. لَتُفْسِدُنَّ فِي الْأَرْضِ. One opinion is that the word أرض is land, meaning the land of Palestine. Fil Arth. Which Arth? the land of Palestine. You're going to create facade in the land twice. Others would argue the word ard can also mean earth. And you know that from the Quran. Sometimes when Allah talks about earth, He uses the word ard. Ardi was sama, the earth and the heaven, the skies. So if you think about it in the context of today, the facade that Israel is committing, is it only in the land of Palestine? No. They're continuously massacring people outside of that. Lebanon. They killed people in Dubai. They killed people.
Syria.
Syria. And the mischief that has been created, this has become a globalized problem. You're in Canada and people are now demonstrating on the streets. You're in Australia, people are demonstrating on the streets. This is you know, remember at the beginning of this massacre, about a week into these events, after October 7th, after the Palestinian uprising of October the 7th, there was a child of Palestinian descent that was gunned down in America. Do you remember? His next door neighbor killed. Do you remember that poor child? I think his name was Hamza, I think.
Yeah, no, and the hate in Chicago, I think it was.
Hate crimes in Chicago.
And we actually have somebody in our support circle who lives in Chicago, blocks away from that, who shared that. So it is very, very.
SubhanAllah. That's terrible. Can you imagine being so close to that?
Yeah, SubhanAllah.
So the point I make is ard limited to the land of Palestine, or is it a globalized mischief that they're making?
I mean, it's at the moment in the UK when we can't, you know, the cutting down, saying we can't have people protesting, can't have people carrying the Palestinian flag, or this conflation between Zionism and you know, anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, to say any criticism of the Israeli government equals criticism of the Torah, which
exactly. This is globalized corruption. Or, for example, the extent of the power that these people have over the American Congress. People in America, they don't have proper housing. They don't have healthcare. Their roads are crumbling. The infrastructure is crumbling. And instead of giving these people, the citizens of the United States of America, healthcare, America gives $100 billion worth of military equipment and support to Israel. Can you see the corruption? The corruption fil ard is not limited to the land of Palestine. It is a mental corruption around the earth. It is a propagandist corruption. It is a fiscal, economic, political, military corruption fil ard, the entirety of the earth. Marratain, twice. وَلَتَعْلُنَّ عُلُوًّا كَبِيرًا, and you will become extremely insolent. خير. فإذا جاء وعد أولاهما بعثنا عليكم عبادا لنا. When this happens, we will send against you. We, Allah, takes ownership of this. بعثنا عليكم. We are going to raise against you ibadan. Subhanallah. Doesn't say Musliman. Ibadan lana, our servants. Now, you know, Sayyid, you know, an abd of Allah is not an ordinary thing. You know, when the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi went to Mi'raj, Allah honored him with the title of being an abd. He's a proper servant of God, right? And that's the beginning of this very surah. Even if you scroll up a couple of verses, right, you will see at the very, very beginning of this surah, Subhanalladhi asra bi abdihi layla min al-masjid al-harami ila al-masjid al-aqsa.
Subhanallah.
So an abd in the context of this surah is not an ordinary, it's not like, Allah is sending, He's sending people who are proper servants of God. To do what? Uli ba'sin shadid, to have great might, strength, power, prowess. Fajasu khilal ad-diyar, and they will free these homes that you have taken. وَكَانَ وَعْدًا مَفْعُولًا. This is a promise that is absolutely going to be fulfilled. Now, to me, as an ordinary human being, if I read the Quran and God is giving a promise, I wouldn't want to be in Israel's shoes. I wouldn't want to be the ones that have done such great fasad fil ard, and then be the one that God himself has to send servants to in order to be able to correct it. It's not, you're not going to be in a winning position, right? So these verses are highly insightful, highly instructive, and give us great hope for humanity that these events are going to unfold, and they're unfolding in front of our eyes, and that we can be part of that group, uli ba'sin shadid. We can be part of ibadan lana, that can actually be party to that. Now, a hadith talk about whom this is. Hadith comes from the fifth Imam of Ahl al-Bayt, Muhammad al-Baqir, salawatullah wa salamuhu alayh, when he is asked, who is this uli ba'sin shadid? Who are those people of such great prowess? And the Imam says, Wallahi, they are Ahl Qum. They are the people of the city of Qum in Iran. They are the leaders of this movement that are actually going to liberate this land that has been so badly destroyed and ravaged by Banu Israel. I hope that gives us something to think about from the Quranic perspective, inshallah.
Inshallah, no. Thank you so much for taking us through looking at the Quran in this lens. And of course, this is the beauty of the Quran, that whenever you do look at it, it seems like it's talking about today, and this is the I guess the beautiful concept. I know we have a few minutes perhaps for Q&A. So if you do want, you can use the Q&A to write something down while people are doing that. We talked about insolence, and looking at the fact now that the Security Council was blocked by sadly UK with its abstention, and US by vetoing it, that it then went to the General Assembly, and that notion is not legally binding. And I don't think the government has even issued a statement on response to that UN resolution, and it adds to this concept of extreme arrogance, where you have the international community, and now because of that, actual people within the US government who are, we had people who, I think it was someone who worked in the Secretary of State who resigned. And then recently we're seeing protests outside of US from the, not people, the employees which are within the current administration, that it is really, like I said at the start, it couldn't be any clearer, the corruption. It's not that it's, sometimes corruption is a bit difficult to see. And it reminds me of Fir'aun. It reminds me of, what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when he basically, he says, I'm God. And that type of arrogance, that tyrannical arrogance that we see, that when it is clearly shown by the majority of the governments in the world who are saying that this is unethical, this is wrong. The whole reason perhaps that the Geneva Conventions or the UN were were put in place to avoid conflicts like this, and yet still that very body is helpless or seems to be helpless with its own UN members being killed, and um, and I think for me it is, and I think I speak for a lot of Muslims here, um, an incredibly catastrophic event, which I think it would be very difficult, even when the war will end, or what happens after that, to then move on from that, because it feels the injustice seems at another level. And I don't know whether that's because we see it every day. We didn't see these things in the past when they happened, or because we're so globally connected now that we know everything which is happening. So what I wanted to do with all of this injustice, and if we want to be ibadan lana, what are some of our responsibilities? Obviously it's about education. What are some of our responsibilities? And as well, I think also we have responsibilities to the Jewish community who has perhaps been maligned by this, the Jews who don't support this, to kind of have this. We remember 9/11 happening, everybody blaming it on the Muslims, and having that type of, so we have that understanding, but also in terms of what are some of our responsibilities if this is talking, the verse is clearly talking about military might, or it's talking about things like that. What are some of our responsibilities here?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. The minimum duty that we have is to speak out and to be able to make our voice heard, and to be able to clarify the realities of what's happening on the ground, the realities of the propaganda, and to help people actually see truth as truth is. So first we have to do that for ourselves. We have to be able to inspire ourselves with the right knowledge, with the right sources of knowledge, to be able to understand what's happening. And this is mentioned in the actual books, that there's a supplication, Allahumma arinil haqqa haqqan fattabi'ahu wa arinil batila batilan fajtanibahu. Oh Allah, let me be able to see truth as truth is, so I can follow it. And help me to see falsehood as falsehood is, so I can turn away from it. So we have to enlighten ourselves. That's our first duty. Second duty is to be able to share it with others. That is known in the Islamic theory as jihad at-tabyin. Jihad means a struggle for a cause. When there's a struggle, there's always an enemy, there's always an opponent against you. When I struggle against myself, I am the opponent, right? If I have low desires and then I'm trying to defeat them, it's jihad an-nafs. So who is the enemy here? My lower self. So when we do jihad at-tabyin, the opponent is those people that are causing corruption, disinformation, purposeful propaganda away from truth. That's the opponent. Then what type of jihad is it? Tabyin, to make clear truth from falsehood. This is the minimal duty that we have in this time. After that, the levels of activism range from the potential and the capacity that each person has. For some people, it's marching and demonstrating. For some people, it's education, like this video that you and I are creating, mashallah. You've done a brilliant job to try to open it to your audience, help them to understand the realities of what's going on. For others, it's to write books or to write articles. For others, they are doing direct intervention. They're going to Elbit systems, a an arms manufacturer that is sending bombs against Palestinians every single day. Women, children, elderly, disabled people being massacred with these bombs. And some people are breaking into Elbit systems and breaking missiles, doing their bit. So everyone then has to judge their duty and their capacity above and beyond simply speaking. To whom we speak, how we speak, in which ways we fight back, those are determined according to everyone's individual capacity and opportunities. But the minimum duty we have is to be able to speak out and to be a thorn in the eye of the oppressor and to try to change the situation so that there's a moral conscience, a moral awakening in the world that says that the last apartheid state, the last semblance of colonialism, that I can occupy a land of another and tear their whole fabric of their society apart because I think I'm better, like the Brits did in India. Well, you know, we're bringing the gospel, we're bringing Jesus, so we can just take over India for 200 years and pulverize it. The last semblances of this notion that exists within some people's minds, within humanity, we have to crush this. We have to defeat it. We have to remove it from the psyche, from the existence of mankind, put it in the ashtrays of history, that this is unbefitting of a human community. And that's what we're doing. That's what we're doing. We're speaking out, we're fighting against that notion, that supremacy, that God gave me this land, God gave me this position over you, therefore I can massacre you, whether it's from Muslims, whether it's from Hindus and extreme Hinduism, whether it's from Judaism and Zionism, we oppose it. Whether it's from the American Empire or the British Empire, we oppose it. And that's what we're doing. That's what this conversation is. We're shedding light on where this abuse of religion stems from and how the Quran responds to it and how we as human beings and as Muslims can respond to it as well.
And it is amazing how clear the Quran is in this. And we do find our scholars being very clear in this in terms of, we have in our Tawzi al-Masail, do not buy products which are coming. And we are seeing the effects of that now when people choose not to, purchase items from places which are supporting that regime. We are seeing the effects of how that is powerful, and I think sometimes we don't think collectively, and we don't think that if we were to actually have, like you said, even a because the first thing you think is military, but actually you think you have other ways you can demonstrate your opposition to something. If they're not forcing sanctions, well, there's an economic sanction we can have to say, no, we're not going to agree with that. So realizing that we just by having the current powers that we have in terms of what we buy, what we support, what we talk about, we still have a lot of power to make a difference. And I think sometimes people think that, oh, what do you mean raising awareness is not going to help? But I think the thing which I saw was odd was we had known from the Muslim community, we'd been going to Quds marches, it was already embedded in our understanding. And yet we're now seeing the world waking up to say, oh, and we're like, of course, this was happening for 75 years. Why is the world waking up now to this? And this shows that we are living in an age of Jahiliyyah. We are living in an age of ignorance. And then that what you just said of raising awareness, when in my head, I might think, that's the minimum. But actually, even the minimum has a huge effect in waking other people up to something that they just don't know. They don't, they've not been told.
Yes, exactly. And we're all every little bit that we do adds up, and until it becomes a critical mass in the world to say that this is no longer acceptable for us.
Absolutely. Well, I know that Sheikh Na has another lecture to run to after this, and I really want to thank him for all the work that he does in for the UK community, especially Leeds community where he resides. And as I said, I think there's someone here even who we went to with the Leeds Mosque and we had that event. So I pray that may Allah bless you to raise awareness further in all that you're doing. Really thank you for this time that you have given us here. I hope to take the learning of Islamic finance in terms of loans, which we didn't get to go in depth to, but if you do read Sheikh Na's book on prospering in a living crisis and what the Islamic system actually says to moments like this, where we are facing an incredible living cost crisis and what our responsibilities are, and that's really useful. And inshallah, Sheikh can educate us more on things that we can improve, inshallah. So thank you so much for your time. Inshallah, we see you soon.
Inshallah. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.